August 10, 1945. A single click of a camera shutter changed everything humanity thought it knew about war. But the men behind that lens had no idea he was about to document hell on earth and transform the very meaning of bearing witness. The morning mist clung to Yokosuka Naval Base like a burial shroud, thick and oppressive in the humid August air. 28-year-old Yosuke Yamahata stood at his workbench in the military photography unit, methodically cleaning his Mamiya camera lens for what he assumed would be another routine assignment. The circular motions of his cleaning cloth had become a meditation over 3 years of war, left to right, circular, inspect, repeat. It was this attention to detail that had kept him alive through the burning chaos of Truck Lagoon, the desperate battles in the Philippines, and the 100 smaller skirmishes that had taught him the photographer's first rule: stay invisible, stay alive, capture truth. But something felt different about this morning. Perhaps it was the unusual silence from the radio room, or the way conversations stopped when officers walked past, or the fact that Admiral Ugaki himself had been seen arriving before dawn, unprecedented for a man who usually maintained strict schedule protocols. Whatever it was, Yamahata's photographer's instincts, honed by years of reading situations through a viewfinder, were screaming warnings around him. The photography unit hummed with its usual morning routine. Sergeant Tanaka was sorting through yesterday's reconnaissance prints, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency through images of American bomber formations and damage assessments from the latest raids. Corporal Ito struggled with a jammed enlarger, muttering curses that would have scandalized his grandmother back in Kumamoto. Private Sato, barely 18 and still intimidated by everything military, carefully loaded film into canisters with the concentration of a surgeon. It was peaceful, almost. The kind of mundane military morning that makes war feel like just another job, complete with paperwork and equipment maintenance and the peculiar boredom of waiting for orders. But Yamahata had learned to distrust peaceful moments. In his experience, they usually preceded the kind of chaos that left men scattered across landscapes like broken dolls. And he was about to discover that his instincts were more accurate than he could possibly imagine. The telegraph operator who burst through the door at exactly 0747 hours looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was the color of old rice paper, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness, and his hands shook so violently that the sealed message he carried rattled like dice in a cup. This wasn't the controlled urgency of normal military communications. This was something else entirely. "Message for photographer Yamahata," he announced, his voice cracking on the last syllable. Every conversation in the room stopped. Equipment maintenance ceased. Even the broken enlarger seemed to sense the tension and fell silent. 24 eyes turned toward Yamahata, who felt his stomach drop like a stone into dark water. He accepted the message with hands that appeared steadier than they felt. The envelope was marked with classification stamps he had never seen before, red symbols and codes that suggested levels of secrecy beyond anything a military photographer would normally encounter. His name was written in careful brush strokes across the front, followed by clearance numbers that made his heart race. Inside, the message was brief, typed in the stark military language that reduced human catastrophe to operational parameters. Priority assignment: Yamahata Yosuke. Stop. Proceed. Nagasaki. Immediate stop. Document aftermath. New weapon. Stop. Absolute priority. Stop. Depart 0800. Stop. Duration unknown. Stop. Hazard level classified. Stop. The paper seemed to burn his fingers. Around him, he could feel the weight of expectation, curiosity, and something else: fear. Not the tactical fear of enemy action, but something deeper, more primal. "New weapon," he whispered, not realizing he had spoken aloud. But no one in that room could have imagined that "new weapon" was code for humanity's entry into the atomic age. Senior photographer Lieutenant Kawabe approached with the careful deliberation of a man walking through a minefield. In 3 years of working under Kawabe's command, Yamahata had never seen his superior look genuinely afraid. Concerned, yes. Frustrated, often. But never afraid, with the bone-deep terror that now creased his features and turned his normally confident voice into barely controlled whisper. "Yamahata-san," Kawabe said, placing a hand on his shoulder with unusual formality. "This assignment." He paused, searching for words that seemed inadequate to the task. What you photograph today may be the most important images ever captured by human eyes. Sir, I don't understand. What kind of new weapon requires immediate photography? Why Nagasaki? Why me? Kawabe's grip tightened. Because you're the best at documenting the impossible. You were the only photographer to get clear images during the truck bombardment when everything was burning chaos. You shot through the massacre at Peleliu when other men were paralyzed by what they saw. You have the technical skill and... He struggled for words. You have the strength to see truth without breaking. Sir, you're scaring me. Good. You should be scared. Kawabe's voice dropped even lower. 3 days ago, something happened to Hiroshima. We don't know exactly what, but radio contact was lost completely. Not damaged, lost. As if the city simply stopped existing. Yesterday, we received reports that a single American bomber dropped a single bomb on Nagasaki. One plane. One bomb. And now, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implications hung in the air like poison gas. The weapon that did this to 2 cities, we need to understand what it is, what it does, how it works. But more than that. Kawabe met Yamahata's eyes directly. We need the world to see what was done to Japanese civilians. Whatever this weapon is, however it works, people need to understand its cost. Those words, "the world needs to see," would echo in Yamahata's mind as he prepared for a mission that would transform him from military photographer to witness for all humanity. The preparation for his departure took on an almost ritualistic quality. Yamahata packed his cameras with the same careful attention he had given them for 3 years, but now each action felt weighted with significance. His primary Mamiya, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it through tropical humidity and combat debris. His backup Leica, smaller and faster for action shots. Extra film, carefully sealed against moisture and shock. Light meters, lens filters, chemical supplies for field development if necessary, but as he worked, he became aware that other preparations were happening around him. Medical staff appeared in the photography unit, unusual for a routine assignment. They handed him a small medical kit containing supplies he didn't recognize, pills marked with symbols he couldn't read, bandages that seemed thicker than normal, a strange device that clicked when he pressed a button. "What's this?" he asked the medic. "Radiation detector," the man replied without meeting his eyes. "If it clicks faster than once per second, leave the area immediately." Radiation. Another new word in a war that had already introduced too many new concepts. Chemical weapons, strategic bombing, kamikaze tactics, and now radiation. Yamahata pocketed the device without fully understanding what it meant, but with a growing certainty that he was about to enter territory no human being had ever explored. Around him, his fellow photographers worked with unusual quiet. No one asked questions about his assignment, though he could feel their curiosity like heat from a fire. Military protocol demanded discretion, but more than that, something about this mission felt too large, too important, too dangerous for casual conversation. Sergeant Tanaka approached as Yamahata finished his preparations. "Yamahata-san," he said quietly, "my brother was stationed in Hiroshima. We haven't heard from him since August 6th. He paused, his weathered face creased with worry that went beyond normal wartime anxiety. "If you learn anything about what happened there, I'll find out what I can," Yamahata promised, though he had no idea how he could possibly fulfill such a commitment. At exactly 0800 hours, Yamahata climbed aboard a military transport aircraft, carrying camera equipment that would soon capture the most important photographs in human history. But first, he had to survive the flight to hell. The flight to Nagasaki was unlike any military transport mission Yamahata had experienced. Normally, such flights were routine affairs, pilots focused on navigation, passengers reading reports or catching up on sleep, the steady drone of engines providing background noise for military business as usual. But this flight carried an atmosphere of dread so thick it seemed to press against the aircraft's windows. The pilot, a veteran flyer whose calm competence Yamahata had relied on during previous assignments, seemed visibly shaken. His hands gripped the controls with white-knuckled tension, and he kept checking his instruments with the obsessive frequency of a man who no longer trusted his own skills. The co-pilot was worse, a young officer who kept staring out the window as if expecting the sky itself to burst into flames. "Sir," the navigator called back to Yamahata after they had been flying for an hour, "we're approaching the outer zone. You should prepare yourself." "Outer zone of what?" The navigator didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed Yamahata a pair of binoculars and pointed toward the aircraft's small observation window. "Look toward Nagasaki. Tell me what you see." Yamahata pressed the binoculars to his eyes and focused on the landscape below. For a moment, he saw normal countryside, rice fields, small villages, the familiar patchwork of agricultural Japan that he had grown up loving. But as they flew closer to where Nagasaki should be, the landscape began to change in ways that made no sense. The green fields gave way to brown. The brown gave way to black. And then, where the city should have been, there was nothing, not ruins. Not bombed buildings. Nothing. "I don't understand," Yamahata said, lowering the binoculars. "Where is the city?" "That's what we're here to find out," the pilot called back, but his voice carried no confidence. "Command says Nagasaki is still there. The maps say it should be directly ahead." But he didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. Through the aircraft windows, they could all see the truth that no map could capture. Nagasaki, a city of 240,000 people, had been transformed into a dark scar on the earth so complete that it was visible from 10,000 feet. What they were flying toward defied every understanding of warfare, destruction, and the limits of human technology. The landing at the hastily established airstrip 15 kilometers from Nagasaki's center was controlled chaos. Military vehicles raced back and forth across the makeshift runway, their urgency suggesting an emergency response to something beyond normal military parameters. Medical personnel in strange protective clothing directed the movement of equipment that Yamahata didn't recognize, devices with screens, cables, and warning labels in multiple languages, but it was the personnel themselves that truly alarmed him. These weren't the efficient, confident military professionals he was accustomed to working with. These were men who moved with the careful deliberation of people operating in an environment they didn't understand, following protocols for situations they had never encountered. A medical officer approached as Yamahata disembarked, carrying a device similar to the radiation detector he had been given. "Photographer Yamahata." "Yes, sir. I'm Dr. Matsumoto, medical liaison for operation documentation." The doctor's face was grim behind protective eyewear that made him look like some kind of scientific insect. "Before you proceed to the affected zone, I need to brief you on safety protocols." Affected zone. The area within 5 kilometers of the blast center. Radiation levels are significant. We don't fully understand the long-term effects, but immediate exposure can cause severe health consequences. Dr. Matsumoto's clinical language couldn't disguise his obvious fear. "Your mission is important enough to accept calculated risks, but we need you to understand what those risks are." He handed Yamahata a set of protective clothing, mask, gloves, a strange white coat that felt unusually heavy. "These will provide limited protection. More importantly, this will monitor your exposure." He showed him a badge with a small window that currently showed white. "If this turns black, you must leave the area immediately. No exceptions. No heroic last photographs. Leave immediately." Yamahata pinned the badge to his jacket, feeling its weight like a countdown timer attached to his chest. "How long can I safely stay in the affected zone?" "We don't know. No human being has ever been exposed to radiation at these levels and lived to provide data." Dr. Matsumoto's scientific honesty was more terrifying than any lie could have been. "Your survival will help us understand what this weapon actually does to human beings." In that moment, Yamahata realized he wasn't just being sent to photograph the aftermath of an attack, He was being sent to explore the future of warfare itself. The jeep ride toward Nagasaki passed through landscapes that seemed to belong to different worlds. The first few kilometers looked normal, damaged by conventional bombing, perhaps, but recognizably the Japan that Yamahata had known all his life. Rice fields showed signs of neglect, villages bore the scars of war, but everything remained comprehensibly human in scale and consequence. But as they approached the 5-kilometer perimeter, reality began to break down. Trees that should have been green were black. Not burned black, which would have left charcoal and ash, but a deeper black that seemed to absorb light itself. Fields that should have been brown earth were instead covered with a gray-black crust that looked more like the surface of the moon than agricultural soil. And everywhere, covering everything, was a fine gray dust that settled on the jeep's windshield and gave the entire landscape a ghostly, otherworldly appearance. The driver, a young corporal who couldn't have been more than 20, gripped the steering wheel with hands that shook despite his obvious efforts at control. "Sir," he said without taking his eyes off the road, "my family is from Urakami." That was a district in northern Nagasaki. His voice broke slightly. "I haven't heard from them since August 9th. Yamahata didn't know how to respond. What words could possibly address the magnitude of what they were driving toward? Instead, he checked his camera equipment again, ensuring that his film was properly loaded, his exposures correctly calculated, his lenses clean. The familiar routine helped steady his hands, even as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. "Sir," the driver continued, "what kind of bomb does this? I've seen what happens when the Americans hit a city with hundreds of bombers. But they say this was one plane. One bomb." "I don't know," Yamahata admitted. "That's what we're here to find out." But even as he spoke, he knew that finding out was inadequate to describe what lay ahead. This wasn't military reconnaissance or damage assessment. This was exploration of the impossible. What they discovered as they crossed into the affected zone would challenge every assumption about the nature of war, death, and human technological capability. The moment they crossed into what Dr. Matsumoto had called the affected zone, Yamahata's radiation detector began clicking. Slowly at first, once every few seconds, but with increasing frequency as they drove deeper into the transformed landscape. The sound was innocuous, almost gentle, like a clock ticking in an empty room. But knowing what it represented made each click feel like a countdown to personal catastrophe. "Stop here," Yamahata ordered when they reached a hilltop overlooking what had been central Nagasaki. The driver pulled over and turned off the engine. In the sudden silence, broken only by the increasingly rapid clicking of the radiation detector, they stared down at a scene that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. Below them stretched a landscape that looked as if it had been pressed flat by the hand of a giant. Where buildings had stood, only twisted metal skeletons remained, their shadows permanently burned into the ground beneath them. Where neighborhoods had bustled with life, only geometric patterns of destruction radiated outward from a central point, like ripples frozen in stone and steel. Where trees had provided shade and beauty, only charcoal spikes protruded from earth that looked baked, hardened, transformed into something that was no longer quite soil. But it was the absence that struck him most powerfully. This wasn't destruction in any conventional sense. Conventional bombing left rubble, debris, recognizable fragments of what had been destroyed. This was erasure. Entire city blocks had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the geometric shadows that marked where they had stood. "Oh my God," the driver whispered. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." Yamahata raised his camera with hands that trembled despite his years of experience photographing combat zones. Through his viewfinder, the devastation looked even more alien, more complete, more impossible. The telephoto lens compressed the scene into a flat plane of destruction that stretched beyond the frame in every direction. Click. The first photograph of his Nagasaki series captured a vista of destruction so complete that it would take viewers years to understand what they were seeing. Not a bombed city, but the ghost of a city, the shadow of a place where hundreds of thousands of people had lived and worked and loved and died in a single moment. But as he lowered his camera, Yamahata heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of a human voice calling for help from somewhere in that wasteland. The voice was weak, almost inaudible over the clicking of radiation detectors and the strange whistling of wind through twisted metal, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, speaking Japanese, calling for water. The words drifted up from the ruins below like a message from another world. "Did you hear that?" Yamahata asked the driver. The young corporal's face had gone completely white. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles showed bone white through his skin. "Sir, there's nobody alive down there." "There can't be. The bomb was yesterday. Nobody could survive in that." But Yamahata was already moving, his photographer's instincts overriding military protocol and personal safety. If someone had survived in this landscape of impossibility, their story needed to be documented. More than that, they needed help, regardless of radiation risks or mission parameters. He descended into what had been the Urakami district, his boots crunching on debris that his mind struggled to categorize. Glass mixed with fragments that might once have been bone. Melted metal tangled with organic matter that could have been wood, clothing, or flesh. The distinction no longer mattered in this new geography of atomic destruction. Each step released small puffs of the gray dust that covered everything, dust that his radiation detector suggested was composed of materials no human being should breathe. The voice called again, closer now, directing him through a maze of collapsed structures that had once been homes. Following the sound, Yamahata picked his way through rubble that told stories he didn't want to understand. A child's toy, melted into an unrecognizable mass of plastic and metal. A family photograph, its faces burned away but its frame intact. A Buddhist altar, its wooden structure vaporized but its metal elements fused into abstract sculptures. And then he found her. She was trapped under a collapsed wooden beam that had somehow shielded her from the worst of the blast. An elderly woman, perhaps 70, her traditional kimono burned and torn but still recognizably clothing. Her skin showed the characteristic burns that he would later learn to recognize as radiation damage, and her hair had been singed away, but she was alive. Impossibly, miraculously, tragically alive. "Water," she whispered when she saw him approaching. "Please, water." What Yamahata discovered as he knelt beside this dying woman would transform his understanding of his mission and his responsibility as a witness to history. Yamahata knelt beside the trapped woman, his camera forgotten for the moment as he lifted his canteen to her cracked and bleeding lips. She drank with desperate gratitude, her eyes, still bright with intelligence despite her desperate condition, fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, examined, judged. "Are you a doctor?" she asked when she had drunk enough to speak more clearly. "No, grandmother. I'm a photographer. Military photographer." Her eyes sharpened with understanding. "You're here to take pictures of what they did to us?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, as if this confirmation answered questions she had been asking herself. "Good. Someone should see. Someone should know." Her voice carried a strength that her physical condition made impossible, as if her spirit had become concentrated by suffering into something harder than the steel beams that surrounded them. Only then did Yamahata notice what she clutched against her chest with such fierce protectiveness that not even the collapse of her world could make her release it. A bundle of cloth, carefully wrapped, held against her body with arms that showed terrible burns but would not let go. "My grandson," she explained when she saw his eyes on the bundle. "Kenji. He's 3 years old. I was holding him when the light came." With infinite care, she adjusted the cloth to reveal a small face, a child, unconscious but breathing. The woman's body had protected him from the worst of the radiation, but Yamahata could see the gray pallor that meant internal damage, the way his small chest rose and fell with obvious effort. "He's dying," the woman said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that Yamahata had learned to recognize in people who had passed beyond hope into a different kind of clarity. "I'm dying too. But before we go..." She met his eyes directly. "Will you photograph us? So people know we were here. So they understand what happened to us." The question hit Yamahata like a physical blow. This wasn't just a request for documentation. This was a dying woman asking him to transform her death into testimony, to make her final moments serve as evidence for generations yet unborn. "Yes," he said. "I will photograph you. Promise me," she insisted, her voice growing weaker but more urgent. "Promise me that people will see. Promise me that the world will know what happened here. Not just to soldiers, not just to military targets, but to grandmothers and children. To ordinary people." "I promise," Yamahata said, and felt the weight of that promise settle on his shoulders like a physical burden that he would carry for the rest of his life. That promise, made to a dying grandmother in the ruins of Nagasaki, would drive Yamahata to risk everything to ensure that the world understood the true meaning of atomic warfare. Yamahata raised his camera with hands that shook not from fear, but from the terrible weight of responsibility. This photograph would be different from any he had ever taken. Not just because of its subject matter, but because of its purpose. This wasn't military documentation or strategic intelligence. This was testimony. This was evidence. This was a dying woman's final gift to humanity. He composed the shot carefully, his professional training taking over even as his heart broke. The grandmother and child formed the center of the frame, but he included enough of the surrounding destruction to provide context. The twisted metal beams, the rubble that had once been homes, the gray dust that covered everything, all of it served to illustrate the scale of what had happened here. In that single moment, captured forever on film, everything changed. Not just for Yamahata, but for humanity's understanding of what war could become. That photograph, of a grandmother holding her dying grandson in the atomic ruins, would travel around the world. It would be published in magazines, displayed in museums, studied by historians and peace activists for generations, but more than that, it would serve as proof that atomic weapons didn't just destroy military targets or strategic infrastructure. They destroyed grandmothers and children. They destroyed the ordinary, irreplaceable humanity that gives meaning to civilization itself. "Thank you," the woman whispered as he lowered his camera. "Now they'll know. Now they'll understand." She died 10 minutes later, her grandson still clutched in her arms, her last words a Buddhist prayer for the souls of all who had died in the atomic fire. Yamahata photographed her final moments, his professional duty overriding personal grief, because he understood that this too was part of the story the world needed to know. But as he worked to document the grandmother's death, Yamahata heard the sound of approaching vehicles, and realized that his mission was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The sound of military vehicles approaching through the devastated landscape reached Yamahata just as he finished photographing the grandmother's final moments. The noise was incongruous in the absolute silence of the atomic wasteland, the rumble of engines, the squeal of brakes, the shouts of men who still lived in a world where human voices mattered. "Sir." The voice belonged to his driver, the young corporal who had waited at the jeep while Yamahata descended into the ruins. "Sir, we need to leave. Now." Yamahata looked up from his viewfinder to see not just his own jeep, but 3 other military vehicles racing toward his position. The lead vehicle flew flags he didn't recognize, and its occupants wore protective equipment more sophisticated than anything he had been given. "What's wrong?" he called back, though he continued photographing as he spoke. Around him, other survivors were beginning to emerge from hiding places in the rubble, people who had somehow endured the atomic blast and 2 days of radiation exposure, but who were clearly dying by degrees. "The radiation levels, sir. They're climbing faster than the doctors predicted. We've been here too long already. Radiation. The invisible killer that he could hear but not see, could measure but not feel, could detect but not escape." Yamahata's badge had turned from white to pale yellow to deep amber during his time in the ruins. He didn't need Dr. Matsumoto to tell him what that meant, but around him, other survivors were calling out, asking to be photographed, begging to have their stories recorded before death claimed them. An office worker whose business suit had been burned to his skin. A mother searching frantically through rubble for children who had been vaporized. A doctor who had lost his medical supplies but continued treating patients with strips torn from his own clothing. Each had the same request: photograph us. Tell them what happened here. Make sure the world knows. 5 more minutes, Yamahata called to his driver. Just give me 5 more minutes. Sir, the medical team says, 5 minutes. The choice Yamahata made in that moment would either damn him as a reckless soldier or transform him into history's most important witness. Yamahata made a decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He stayed. I'm not leaving, he announced to the approaching medical team. Not yet. The lead medical officer, a Navy doctor whose protective equipment made him look like a visitor from another planet, approached with obvious anger. Photographer Yamahata, you are in direct violation of safety protocols. Your radiation exposure is already at dangerous levels. How dangerous? You should be experiencing nausea, disorientation, hair loss. You should be dead or dying. Yamahata checked his own condition with the detached professional interest that war had taught him. His hands were steady. His vision remained clear. His stomach, while queasy, hadn't yet progressed to active nausea. I feel fine. That's impossible. According to our instruments, you've been exposed to radiation levels that should kill a human being within hours. Then maybe your instruments are wrong. Or maybe I'm already dead and just don't know it yet. Yamahata raised his camera toward the doctor. Either way, I have work to finish. The doctor stared at him through protective eyewear that made his expression unreadable. You understand that continuing this mission will almost certainly kill you. And abandoning it will certainly kill the story these people need me to tell. Yamahata gestured toward the survivors who were still emerging from the ruins, each one a walking testimony to what atomic weapons actually did to human beings. How do I explain to them that my life is more important than their truth? The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Military protocol demanded that Yamahata obey the medical officer's orders and evacuate immediately. But something larger than military protocol was at stake here, something that had to do with witness, truth, and the responsibility that comes with being present at moments when history pivots. Finally, the doctor reached a decision that would change everything. 15 minutes, he said. No more. And you work with full knowledge that you're probably committing suicide. Understood. With radiation poisoning already beginning to ravage his body, Yamahata had 15 minutes to complete the most important photography assignment in human history. Yamahata worked with methodical efficiency that came from years of combat photography training, but driven by an urgency that transcended anything he had experienced in conventional warfare. Each photograph had to count. Each frame had to tell part of a story too large for any single image to contain. He photographed the shadows. The permanent silhouettes of human beings burned into concrete walls and stone steps, people caught in their final moments by heat so intense it had vaporized flesh and bone while leaving their outlines as eternal testimony. A man pulling a cart. A woman reaching for something. A child at play. They were all that remained of thousands of people who had simply ceased to exist. He photographed the survivors. Each one a walking miracle and a living indictment of atomic warfare. Their stories emerged in fragments as he worked, a businessman who had been in his office basement when the light came, shielded by concrete but slowly dying from radiation. A teacher who had shepherded her students into a shelter that became their tomb. A doctor whose hospital had been vaporized but who continued treating patients in the ruins with whatever materials he could find. He photographed the infrastructure of a city transformed. Buildings that had been twisted into abstract sculptures. Vehicles melted into unrecognizable masses of metal. Streets where the very asphalt had been turned to glass by temperatures that exceeded the surface of the sun. But most importantly, he photographed the human cost. Not just the dead, but the dying. Not just the destroyed, but the survivors who would carry the atomic fire in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Each photograph served as a piece of evidence in humanity's first case study of atomic warfare. His radiation detector was clicking so rapidly now that it sounded like an angry insect. His badge had progressed from amber to deep orange. And despite his earlier claims of feeling fine, he was beginning to experience the first symptoms of radiation sickness, nausea, disorientation, a metallic taste in his mouth that suggested his internal organs were beginning to break down at the cellular level. Still, he continued shooting. But as his body began to succumb to radiation poisoning, Yamahata faced a terrible realization: he might die before anyone ever saw these photographs. By the time the medical team finally insisted on evacuation, Yamahata had shot 6 rolls of film, 150 exposures documenting humanity's introduction to the atomic age. But the rolls of film were useless unless he could get them developed and distributed, and his body was beginning to fail in ways that made such a task seem impossible. The drive back to the medical station was a blur of nausea and semi-consciousness. Yamahata drifted in and out of awareness, his precious film canisters clutched against his chest like sacred relics. At some point, he began vomiting blood, a sign that the radiation had damaged his digestive system beyond the body's ability to repair. The young driver, terrified that his passenger might die before they reached help, drove faster than safety allowed on roads broken by atomic blast. They made it to the makeshift medical facility that had been established for atomic bomb documentation personnel. The same Dr. Matsumoto who had briefed him on safety protocols took one look at Yamahata's condition and shook his head with the grim certainty of a man who had seen too much death. How long was he in the primary radiation zone? Almost 3 hours, sir. 3 hours. Dr. Matsumoto's professional composure cracked slightly. He should have been dead 2 hours ago. But Yamahata wasn't dead. Barely conscious, internally bleeding, his immune system collapsing, but alive. Whether through genetic resistance, pure luck, or the kind of stubborn will that keeps soldiers fighting long after rational men would surrender, he had survived exposure levels that should have killed him within hours. The film, he managed to whisper when Dr. Matsumoto leaned over his stretcher. Must develop the film. What film? Yamahata's hands moved weakly toward the camera bag beside his stretcher. Nagasaki. The bomb. The people. Must show the world. Dr. Matsumoto understood immediately. Word of the atomic bomb mission had reached even the medical units. A photographer had been sent to document the effects of the American superweapon. But no one had expected the photographer to return alive, much less with usable film that might represent the first visual evidence of atomic warfare's true impact. Get me darkroom equipment, Dr. Matsumoto ordered his staff. Now. Sir, we're a medical unit, not a photography laboratory. Then make it a photography laboratory. Find chemicals, find developing equipment, find whatever he needs. The doctor looked down at Yamahata, who was fighting to maintain consciousness despite radiation damage that should have killed him hours earlier. Those photographs might be the most important images ever captured by human hands. In that medical tent, as he fought for his life, Yamahata was about to discover that his photographs would become the center of a controversy that would affect global politics for decades to come. A makeshift darkroom was assembled in a storage tent using medical supplies, improvised equipment, and the kind of desperate innovation that war breeds in people who understand that some tasks are too important for proper procedures. A Navy corpsman who had worked in photography before enlisting volunteered to assist with the development process, working under Yamahata's whispered instructions as radiation poisoning slowly shut down his body's systems. The first images to emerge from the developer solution were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Not because of their technical quality, they were sharp, well-composed, professionally executed despite the impossible conditions under which they had been shot, but because of their content. Here was devastation on a scale that human minds could barely process. Destruction so complete, so thorough, that it looked like aftermath of a natural disaster from another planet. But it wasn't natural. It was man-made. It was the result of a single bomb, dropped from a single aircraft, in a single moment that had redefined humanity's relationship with its own destructive capability. The corpsman developing the photographs began to shake as image after image revealed the true scope of what had happened to Nagasaki. Sir, he said to Dr. Matsumoto, should we be looking at this? Are we authorized to see this? That question would echo through military and political circles for weeks to come. Were these photographs too sensitive for viewing by unauthorized personnel? Too graphic for public consumption? Too politically dangerous for uncontrolled distribution, but as military officers began to gather around the makeshift darkroom, drawn by rumors that the first atomic bomb photographs were being developed, it became clear that the question of authorization was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Who ordered this photography mission? Demanded a colonel whose insignia Yamahata didn't recognize through his radiation-induced haze. Direct authorization from Admiral Ugaki, replied Dr. Matsumoto, reading from Yamahata's original orders. Classification level Tango 77. For military intelligence purposes only, I assume. The tent fell silent as everyone present understood the implications. These photographs, if released to public, would show the world what atomic weapons actually did to human beings. They would strip away sanitized military language of strategic strikes and acceptable casualties, and replace it with images of children burned to shadows and grandmothers dying in radioactive rubble. The film belongs to Imperial Navy, the colonel declared with authority that brooked no argument. It will be classified and reviewed by appropriate authorities before any determination is made about its disposition. No. The word came out as barely a whisper, but it cut through military hierarchy like a blade. Every eye in the tent turned to Yamahata, who was using every ounce of his remaining strength to speak from his medical cot. Private Yamahata, you are not authorized to. The world has the right to see what was done to those people. Each word was an enormous effort, but Yamahata's voice grew stronger with conviction. The grandmother, the child, they asked me to show the world. I gave my word. What happened next in that medical tent would determine whether the world ever learned the truth about atomic warfare, and whether Yamahata would live to see his photographs change the course of human history. The confrontation in the medical tent crystallized around a fundamental question that would define the atomic age: who had the right to control visual evidence of atomic warfare's human cost? The colonel, representing military security and state secrecy, stood on one side. Yamahata, barely able to sit upright but driven by unshakable conviction, represented something larger, the principle that some truths transcend military authority. These images are classified at the highest levels, the colonel repeated, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Even he seemed shaken by what the photographs revealed. Then classification is wrong, Yamahata replied with strength that his physical condition made impossible. If we hide this, if we pretend it didn't happen or minimize what it means, then every death in Nagasaki becomes meaningless. Those people died for nothing. But if the world sees, if people understand what atomic weapons really do to human beings, maybe it won't happen again. Dr. Matsumoto, who had been quietly observing the confrontation while monitoring Yamahata's vital signs, suddenly spoke up. Colonel, this man is dying from radiation exposure sustained while following direct orders from Admiral Ugaki. His blood pressure is failing, his white cell count has collapsed, and his internal organs are shutting down. Whatever decision we make about these photographs, we need to make it quickly. The medical context added urgency to an already tense situation. If Yamahata died before the issue was resolved, the photographs might be buried in military archives forever. But if copies existed elsewhere, attempting to suppress them could create a scandal that would damage Japan's post-war negotiations with Allied forces. A young lieutenant who had been quietly observing the confrontation suddenly offered a solution that would change everything. Sir, what if the photographer's concerns are addressed through proper channels? What if these images are released through official military documentation, with appropriate context and attribution? The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than fighting to suppress evidence that might become public anyway, the military could control its release, shape its context, and use it to demonstrate Japan's commitment to honest documentation of wartime suffering. What exactly are you proposing? The colonel asked carefully. Yamahata drew upon his remaining strength to articulate the most important negotiation of his life. Publish the photographs with full attribution to Imperial Navy Photography Unit. Show the world that Japan documents its own suffering honestly, without attempting to hide or minimize the truth. Let the images speak for themselves about the cost of atomic warfare. And if they're used as propaganda against Japan, then let them be used that way. Truth doesn't become less true because it's politically inconvenient. These pictures show what happened to Japanese civilians. Let the world decide who bears responsibility for that. The colonel's next decision would either launch these photographs toward worldwide distribution or bury them forever in the depths of military secrecy. The colonel weighed his options with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that his next words would influence how history remembered both the atomic bombing and Japan's response to it. He could confiscate the photographs and court-martial Yamahata for insubordination, but if other copies existed, as the lieutenant had cleverly suggested they might, the images would be published anyway, and the military would appear to be covering up evidence of atomic atrocity. On the other hand, if he allowed controlled release of the photographs, the military might be able to shape the narrative around them, demonstrating Japanese commitment to truth while potentially building international sympathy for Japan's civilian suffering. The photographs will be released through official channels, the colonel finally announced, with appropriate context, attribution, and timing determined by high command. They will be presented as evidence of Japan's commitment to honest documentation of wartime suffering. It wasn't everything Yamahata had wanted, but it was enough. Once the images entered the official military system, they would be seen by dozens of officers, staff members, and government officials. Some of those people would understand their historical importance. Some would ensure they reached appropriate journalists, publications, and international audiences. Agreed, Yamahata whispered, then collapsed back onto his medical cot. The effort of negotiating had pushed him to the very limits of his survival. But as he closed his eyes, he could still see those haunting shadows burned into stone, still hear the grandmother's dying request to tell the world what had happened to her and her grandson. He had kept his promise. The rest was up to history. Little did Yamahata know that his photographs would travel further and have greater impact than he could possibly imagine, but the cost to his own body would prove higher than anyone had predicted. 3 weeks later, Yamahata was transferred to a naval hospital in Tokyo, where the best radiation specialists in Japan struggled to understand how he had survived exposure levels that should have killed him within hours. The radiation had damaged his blood cells, destroyed his immune system, and begun breaking down his digestive tract, but somehow his body continued to function. Doctors called it a medical miracle. Yamahata called it responsibility. He couldn't die until he knew his photographs had reached their intended audience. During his hospitalization, the photographs began their journey around the world. The first publication came in Mainichi Shimbun on August 21, 1945, just 11 days after he had walked through the ruins of Nagasaki. The newspaper devoted an entire page to his images, with minimal text. The editors understood that these photographs needed no explanation, no commentary, no context beyond the simple caption, Nagasaki, August 10, 1945. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time, Japanese civilians saw visual evidence of what the American new weapon had actually done to their countrymen. The photographs showed not strategic military targets that had been neutralized, but ordinary people, children, grandmothers, teachers, doctors, who had been vaporized, burned, and poisoned by the most powerful weapon ever created. Within days, the images had been picked up by international news services. Life magazine published them in a special issue that sold more copies than any previous edition. Newspapers across America, Europe, and the rest of the world ran them on front pages. Radio broadcasters described them in horrified detail to audiences who had previously understood atomic bombs only as abstract strategic concepts. The photographs achieved exactly what Yamahata had hoped. They forced humanity to confront the true meaning of atomic warfare. But they also achieved something he hadn't anticipated. They began to change how the world understood the relationship between military technology and human suffering. But as his images circulated around the globe, Yamahata received news that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his mission and its consequences. The revelation came in the form of a classified briefing that Yamahata was shown 4 weeks after his return from Nagasaki. His photographs had indeed traveled the world, but they had also traveled up military and political chains of command to the highest levels of multiple governments. "Your photographs have been seen by Emperor Hirohito," the briefing officer informed him. "And by General MacArthur. and by President Truman himself. Yamahata absorbed this information with growing amazement. His camera, his decision to stay in the radiation zone, his negotiation in the medical tent, all of it had somehow resulted in world leaders viewing images of atomic destruction. What was their reaction? He asked. The briefing officer consulted his classified documents. President Truman reportedly stared at your photograph of the grandmother and child for several minutes without speaking. Then he asked his advisors if there were additional atomic weapons ready for immediate use. And when told that several more bombs were available, he ordered a temporary halt to nuclear weapon production pending a comprehensive review of their effects on civilian populations. Yamahata's heart stopped. You mean your photographs may have prevented additional atomic bombings? The war ended 6 days later with Japan's surrender, but military plans had called for potential use of atomic weapons on additional Japanese cities if surrender was delayed. The implications hit Yamahata like a physical blow. His photographs hadn't just documented history, they had changed it. By showing the world the true cost of atomic warfare, he had potentially saved hundreds of thousands of lives that would have been lost in additional nuclear attacks, but the briefing officer wasn't finished. There's more. Your photographs have been submitted to the newly formed United Nations War Crimes Commission as evidence for establishing international protocols regarding weapons of mass destruction. The most shocking revelation was yet to come, and it would forever change how Yamahata understood his role in shaping humanity's atomic future. Your images are being used as foundational evidence for a new legal concept called crimes against humanity, the briefing officer continued. Legal scholars are arguing that atomic weapons cause indiscriminate suffering on a scale that violates international laws of warfare, regardless of which nation employs them. The irony was staggering. Yamahata, a Japanese military photographer, had created evidence that was being used to establish legal precedents that could prevent any nation from using atomic weapons against civilian populations in the future. His documentation of Japanese suffering was becoming the foundation for international law that transcended national boundaries. Will Japan press war crimes charges? Yamahata asked. No. The political situation makes that impossible. But the legal framework is being established now. Your photographs have created historical documentation that can never be denied, forgotten, or suppressed. Future generations will know exactly what atomic weapons do to human beings, regardless of what governments or military leaders claim. Yamahata closed his eyes and thought of the grandmother in Nagasaki, asking him to photograph her and her grandson so the world would know they had existed. In that moment, she had understood something that even he hadn't fully grasped, that bearing witness to atrocity was not just about recording history, but about preventing its repetition. His photographs had become more than documentation. They had become a warning, a legal precedent, and a moral standard that would influence how humanity approached the atomic age. There's one more thing, the briefing officer said, consulting his papers again. The photographs have sparked what international observers are calling a nuclear consciousness movement. Scientists who worked on the atomic bomb project, after seeing your images, have begun speaking out against further nuclear weapons development. As he lay in his hospital bed, Yamahata realized that the most important part of his story was just beginning. 8 months later, Yamahata was discharged from the hospital. The radiation had taken its permanent toll. He would suffer health problems, including cancer, for the rest of his life, but he had survived when every medical prediction said he should have died. Doctors attributed his recovery to youth, genetics, and extraordinary luck. Yamahata attributed it to purpose. He had been kept alive to see his photographs serve their intended function. His images had now circulated to every continent on Earth. They had been reprinted in dozens of languages, displayed in museums from New York to London to Moscow, and studied by military strategists, political leaders, and peace activists worldwide. More importantly, they had been seen by millions of ordinary citizens who, for the first time, understood what atomic warfare actually meant in human terms. The photographs had also sparked new movements and organizations. Scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project, horrified by seeing the human cost of their creation, formed the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and began advocating for nuclear arms control. Religious leaders across multiple faiths used the images to illustrate sermons about the moral implications of weapons of mass destruction. Artists and writers found in them inspiration for works that explored humanity's new relationship with the power to destroy itself, but perhaps most significantly, the photographs had influenced the emerging international discussion about nuclear weapons control. When the United Nations established its Atomic Energy Commission, Yamahata's images were among the evidence presented to argue for international oversight of nuclear weapons development. They helped establish the principle that some weapons were simply too destructive to be used without global consensus. "You become more than a photographer," his former commanding officer told him during a reunion of the military photography unit. "You've become a witness for humanity." The description felt accurate but insufficient. Yamahata had indeed become a witness, but to what exactly? To the destructive capability of atomic weapons, certainly. But also to the human capacity for survival, for bearing witness, for transforming suffering into wisdom. But Yamahata's greatest challenge was yet to come, and it would test whether his photographs could ultimately serve their highest purpose. In 1947, 2 years after the bombing, Yamahata received an invitation that would test everything he had learned about the responsibility of bearing witness. The newly formed United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization wanted him to speak at their first international conference on photography and historical documentation. The conference would bring together photographers, historians, and government officials from around the world to discuss the role of visual evidence in preserving historical truth and preventing future atrocities. Yamahata had never spoken publicly about the deeper aspects of his Nagasaki experience. He had given interviews to newspapers and magazines, but always focusing on technical aspects of his photography work or factual details about the atomic bombing's aftermath. The profound questions, what it felt like to document such complete devastation, how it had changed his understanding of warfare and human nature, whether he believed his photographs had served their intended purpose, these he had kept private. But the UN invitation was different. They weren't asking him to speak as a military photographer documenting enemy weapon effects. They weren't asking him to speak as a Japanese citizen bearing witness to his nation's suffering. They were asking him to speak as a human being who had seen humanity at its worst and somehow found a way to transform that vision into hope for humanity's future. The preparation for his speech forced Yamahata to confront questions he had been avoiding. What was the relationship between witnessing atrocity and preventing its repetition? How could visual evidence be used not just to document suffering, but to build empathy across national and cultural boundaries? What responsibilities came with being present at moments when human history pivoted toward either destruction or redemption? The speech he delivered in Paris on September 15, 1947, would become one of the most quoted statements about the moral responsibility of bearing witness to human suffering. "When I walked through Nagasaki with my camera, I did not think I was making history. I thought I was recording the end of it. I thought I was documenting the moment when human beings had finally developed the capability to destroy themselves completely and permanently. But I have learned that every act of bearing witness is an act of hope. When we document suffering, we affirm that suffering matters. When we preserve evidence of atrocity, we declare that such atrocities are not acceptable. When we force people to see what war really does to human beings, we plant seeds of peace that may grow in ways we cannot anticipate." The international response to Yamahata's speech marked a turning point not just for him personally, but for the global understanding of atomic weapons and their place in human civilization. The response to Yamahata's Paris speech was immediate and profound. Delegates from 47 nations rose in a standing ovation that lasted over 7 minutes. More importantly, the conference established new international protocols for documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity, with Yamahata's Nagasaki photographs serving as the template for future evidence collection and preservation. But the personal impact on Yamahata was equally significant. For the first time since August 10, 1945, he felt that his survival of the radiation exposure had been fully justified. He had lived not just to take those photographs, but to help the world understand what they meant and how they could be used to build a more peaceful future. In the years that followed, Yamahata continued his work as a photographer, but his focus shifted from military documentation to peace advocacy and education. He traveled extensively, speaking at universities, museums, and peace conferences around the world. Wherever he went, he carried enlargements of his Nagasaki photographs, not as artifacts of destruction, but as tools for teaching and preventing future atrocities. These images are not meant to shock you, he would tell audiences. They are meant to help you remember. Because the moment we forget what atomic weapons actually do to human beings is the moment we become capable of using them again. His photographs became instrumental in several key international agreements. The 1949 Geneva Conventions included provisions for protecting civilian populations that were directly influenced by visual evidence from Nagasaki. The 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed by leaders who had all seen Yamahata's images. The 1968 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty included language about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons that traced directly back to his documentation. By 1955, his photographs had been cited in over 300 academic papers, 75 government reports, and countless peace advocacy publications. They had been translated into every major language and had influenced military doctrine, international law, and peace education across the globe. But Yamahata's most profound revelation about his life's work came in 1965, 20 years after walking through the ruins of Nagasaki. In August 1965, on the 20th anniversary of the atomic bombing, Yamahata returned to Nagasaki for the first time since his documentation mission. The city had been rebuilt completely, transformed from a radioactive wasteland into a thriving port city that showed no visible signs of the atomic destruction. Where shadows had been burned into stone, memorial parks now flourished. Where radiation had poisoned the earth, children played in gardens that bloomed with extraordinary beauty. But the most meaningful moment of his return came when Yamahata visited the peace memorial that had been erected near the site where he had photographed the dying grandmother and her grandson. To his amazement, he discovered that one of his photographs, the image of the woman holding the child in the atomic ruins, had been enlarged and placed at the center of the memorial, with an inscription in Japanese, English, French, Russian, Chinese, and Arabic, in memory of all who died here, and in hope that no others will share their fate. Their suffering was witnessed. Their story was told. Their sacrifice demands that we choose peace over war, cooperation over conflict, life over death. May all who see this image understand, we have the power to destroy ourselves, but we also have the power to choose not to use it. Standing before that memorial, surrounded by school groups from around the world who had come to study the history of atomic warfare, Yamahata finally understood the full meaning of what had happened to him in 1945. He hadn't just been a photographer on assignment. He hadn't just been a soldier following orders. He had been chosen, by circumstances, by survival, by the dying words of a grandmother, to carry a message from the atomic age to all of human history. That message was both simple and profound. Humanity had created the power to destroy civilization itself, but humanity also retained the power to choose not to exercise that capability. As Yamahata stood before the memorial, he realized that his photographs had achieved something he never could have imagined when he first clicked his camera shutter in the ruins of Nagasaki. By 1965, 20 years after the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, no nation had used an atomic weapon in warfare. Military strategists attributed this restraint to various factors: the balance of terror between nuclear powers, international treaties, the fear of retaliation. But peace researchers increasingly pointed to a different factor: the development of what they called nuclear consciousness, a global awareness of atomic weapons' human cost that made their use psychologically and politically impossible. At the center of that consciousness were Yamahata's photographs. Your images made nuclear war unthinkable, Dr. Margaret Chen, an American peace researcher, told Yamahata during the 1965 memorial ceremony. Before your photographs, atomic bombs were abstract strategic concepts discussed in terms of megatonnage and delivery systems. After your photographs, they became concrete human tragedies associated with grandmothers and children. That change in perception may have saved our species. Yamahata accepted this assessment with characteristic humility. I was just a photographer doing his job. The real heroes were the people who survived long enough to ask me to tell their story. But privately, he knew that something extraordinary had occurred in August 1945. A single man with a camera had documented humanity's entry into the atomic age, and those images had somehow helped humanity step back from the brink of atomic self-destruction. The grandmother's dying request, "Tell the world what happened to us," had been fulfilled beyond anything she could have imagined. Her story, and the stories of thousands of others captured in Yamahata's photographs, had become part of the collective human memory that guided decisions about war and peace. They had helped establish what would become known as the Nagasaki principle, the idea that some weapons are simply too terrible to use, regardless of military advantage or political justification. The final chapter of Yamahata's story would prove that even in death, his photographs continued to shape humanity's relationship with atomic weapons. Yamahata lived until 1966, dying at age 48 from cancer directly linked to his radiation exposure in Nagasaki. But in his final years, he received thousands of letters from around the world, from students who had studied his photographs in school, from veterans who credited his images with helping them understand the true meaning of warfare, from ordinary citizens who said his pictures had changed their perspective on peace and conflict. Most meaningful to him were letters from children. Young people born after 1945 who had grown up in a world where atomic weapons existed but had never been used in warfare since Nagasaki. These children, now adults with families of their own, wrote to thank him for helping create the visual record that made nuclear war psychologically impossible for their generation. "Because of your photographs," wrote Sarah Mueller, a young mother from Germany, "my children know what atomic weapons really do to people like them. When they ask me why anyone would create such terrible weapons, I show them your pictures. Then they understand that the question isn't why we created them, but why we choose not to use them." On his deathbed, Yamahata requested that his original camera, the one he had carried into the Nagasaki ruins, be donated to the newly established Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Along with it, he sent a final message that would be engraved on a plaque beside the camera display. This camera recorded humanity's darkest moments so that it might help create humanity's brightest future. To all who see it, remember that you are capable of both creation and destruction. Choose creation. Choose life. Choose peace. The grandmother and child in Nagasaki are watching, and they are counting on you to make the right choice. Today, more than 75 years after Yamahata walked through the ruins of Nagasaki, his photographs remain among the most important historical documents ever created, but their true impact extends far beyond their historical value. In the decades since Yamahata's death, his photographs have taken on almost mythic significance in global peace movements and nuclear policy discussions. They have been credited with influencing every major nuclear disarmament treaty, with shaping public opinion against nuclear weapons proliferation, and with creating the visual vocabulary that peace activists use to argue against weapons of mass destruction. Military historians note that between 1945 and the present day, numerous conflicts have occurred where nuclear weapons could have been used but weren't. In each case, they argue, decision-makers were influenced by the collective memory of Nagasaki, a memory preserved and transmitted primarily through Yamahata's photographs. Those images fundamentally changed how humanity thinks about ultimate weapons, notes Dr. James Patterson, director of the International Institute for Peace Studies at Stanford University. Before 1945, weapons were judged primarily by their military effectiveness and strategic value. After Yamahata's photographs, weapons began to be judged by their human cost and moral implications. That shift in perspective may have saved our species from nuclear self-destruction. The photographs have also influenced art, literature, film, and popular culture in ways that continue to shape how new generations understand the atomic age. They appear in history textbooks around the world, form the centerpiece of peace education curricula in dozens of countries, and inspire museum exhibits that teach visitors about the relationship between technology and human responsibility. Contemporary photographers and journalists working in conflict zones around the world often cite Yamahata as an inspiration and moral guide. His example demonstrates that individual courage in bearing witness to atrocity can influence the entire course of human history. But perhaps most importantly, the photographs continue to serve their original purpose, bearing witness to human suffering in order to prevent its repetition. In an age when new forms of mass destruction, cyber warfare, biological weapons, artificial intelligence weapons systems, threaten civilian populations, Yamahata's images remind us that the fundamental questions about warfare and human responsibility remain as relevant as ever. The question that remains is whether Yamahata's legacy will prove sufficient for the challenges humanity faces in the 21st century and beyond. Today, 9 nations possess nuclear weapons capable of destroying human civilization multiple times over. New technologies create fresh possibilities for mass destruction that exceed even atomic weapons in their potential for causing human suffering. Climate change threatens global catastrophe on a scale that could surpass even nuclear war in its impact on human civilization. In this context, Yamahata's photographs serve as more than historical documents. They serve as a reminder of what happens when technology outpaces wisdom, when military capability exceeds moral restraint, when the power to destroy is not balanced by the commitment to preserve and protect human life. The grandmother in Nagasaki who asked Yamahata to tell the world her story could not have imagined that her dying words would influence global policy for decades to come. But her request, and Yamahata's response to it, established a principle that remains relevant for every generation. Those who witness suffering have a moral responsibility to prevent its repetition. Modern photographers, journalists, and documentarians working in conflict zones around the world carry forward Yamahata's legacy every time they risk their lives to document atrocity, bear witness to injustice, or preserve evidence of human suffering. His example reminds them that individual acts of courage and conscience can influence the course of history in ways that extend far beyond what any single person might imagine possible. But Yamahata's story also raises difficult questions about the responsibility of bearing witness in an age of instant global communication. In 1945, it took weeks for his photographs to reach international audiences. Today, images of atrocity can circle the globe in seconds. Does this increased speed of communication increase our responsibility to act on what we see? Or does it risk desensitizing us through overexposure to human suffering? These questions remain relevant as humanity continues to grapple with the legacy of the atomic age that Yamahata helped document and, through his documentation, helped shape. In the end, Yamahata's photographs remind us that the most important question is not what we are capable of, but what we choose to do with our capabilities. What Yosuke Yamahata saw in the ruins of Nagasaki on August 10, 1945, was more than the aftermath of a single atomic bomb. He saw humanity's future, a future where the power to destroy civilization itself had become a permanent feature of the global landscape, where the fate of the species would depend not on our technological capabilities but on our moral choices. But he also saw something else that proved equally important: the power of witness, the importance of truth, and the possibility that documenting horror could somehow contribute to preventing its repetition. His photographs achieved their ultimate purpose. Not through their technical excellence, though they were masterfully composed and executed under impossible conditions, but through their moral clarity. They stripped away the euphemisms and abstractions that military and political leaders used to describe warfare and replaced them with concrete human reality that could not be ignored, denied, or forgotten. In doing so, they helped establish one of the most important principles of the modern age: that some weapons are simply too terrible to use, regardless of military advantage, political justification, or strategic necessity. The dying grandmother who asked Yamahata to photograph her and her grandson understood something profound about the relationship between bearing witness and shaping the future. She knew that her story, if properly told and widely seen, could become part of the collective human memory that guides our choices about war and peace, destruction and creation, death and life. She was right. Today, more than 75 years after Yamahata walked through the ruins of Nagasaki, his photographs continue to serve as humanity's reminder of what we are capable of, and why we must choose to be capable of better. They remind us that every generation faces the choice between using our power to destroy or using our power to create, between giving into our worst impulses or rising to our highest aspirations. The camera shutter that clicked on August 10, 1945, captured more than the aftermath of atomic destruction. It captured a moment of choice, a decision by one man to bear witness to atrocity in the hope that bearing witness might help prevent its repetition. That choice, and its continuing consequences, may be Yosuke Yamahata's greatest gift to humanity: the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, we retain the power to choose light over darkness, creation over destruction, life over death. The answer to the question posed in our title, "What did this Japanese soldier see that the world had to know?" is both simple and profound. He saw the future. He saw what human beings could do to each other when technology outpaced wisdom and when the power to destroy exceeded the commitment to preserve. But he also saw something else. He saw that bearing witness to that destruction could help humanity choose a different path, and by showing that future to the world, he helped us understand that we always have a choice. That may be the most important photograph ever taken, not because of what it captured, but because of what it prevented. In the end, Yamahata's legacy reminds us that bearing witness to suffering is not just about recording history, it's about changing it, and sometimes, a single camera click can echo through eternity, reminding us that our greatest power is not the power to destroy, but the power to choose not to destroy. The grandmother and child in Nagasaki are still watching. They are still counting on us to make the right choice.